Thanks everybody for coming to our talk. I am technical difficulties. All right, there we go. All right, so I'm Dawn Foster. I'm Director of Data Science for the Chaos Project. I've been doing this open source thing for 20 plus years, so a really long time. I've worked at companies like Intel and VMware doing open source. I also have some other roles outside of the Chaos Project. So I'm co-chair of the Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group under the CNCF, and I'm also a board member of Open UK. And I'm also on the board of the Chaos Project.
Hi, I'm Cali Dolfi. I'm a senior data scientist at Red Hat, and I work in the open source program office, and I lead a project in there that focuses around doing data science on open source communities. Big surprise.
Awesome. All right. So the data tsunami. One of the biggest challenges people have with data is that it can be overwhelming, right? Now, this is especially true when you're looking at metrics for open source projects, where all of the data is available to gather and analyze. So too often, I see people measuring what's easy to count, easy to understand, things like stars and forks, which don't really tell you much about the health of your open source project. Quite a few metrics tools, including the ones we have in the Chaos Project, display what I affectionately call a wall of metrics. So these are pages and pages of visualizations that you can use to understand your open source project. And they're great, but they require you to know what you're looking at and know where to focus your energy to get the data that you need. So we have visualizations for dozens and dozens of metrics, and all of them can be super useful. But which ones you should focus on depend on what you want to achieve. Ideally, you should be looking at visualizations that help you find areas that you can improve, or ways that you can measure what you're achieving, whether or not you're achieving your goals as a project. Within the Chaos Project, we tend to look at metrics as being used for two primary purposes. Historically, Chaos has been a bit more focused on what I call contribution metrics, so the box at the top. And these metrics are designed to be used to better understand the projects that you're participating in. Whether these are open source projects or other projects, open source projects that you run, or maybe open source projects that you just contribute to. And we have a starter project health metrics model with a collection of 4 very simple metrics to help you get started measuring contribution. And we have a whole bunch of other metrics models on similar topics to help you dig in for more details. And lately, we've been also focusing on consumption metrics, which is the second type. So that's the box at the bottom. And these metrics are mostly related to inbound or downstream consumption of open source software. So the software that you use from within your projects, your products, maybe your infrastructure. And we have a starter viability metrics model with 6 metrics. So these are some models that Gary White at Verizon developed for us. I told him his starter project health metrics model had to have 4 metrics, and he made it 6. He just couldn't cut it down to 4. Everything was too important, which to be fair, it's kind of hard. But these are used to measure the viability of the open source projects that you consume. And Gary also developed 4 complete viability metrics models with a whole bunch of metrics that were developed recently to help you gather more information about the projects that you're consuming. And these collections of metrics are organized into metrics models, which can all be found at the link on the bottom of the slide to help you think about how you might implement a set of metrics together to understand some aspect of open source project health. But a big part of using data is figuring out what questions you have and how you can take this tsunami of data and figure out which metrics can help you turn it into something more meaningful. So in the next section, Cali is going to talk about how to do this using approaches from data science and what she's learned from building the 8-knot visualization interface for Chaos's Augur software. Take it away, Cali.
Awesome, thank you. So, let me. I just see. So, I'm first going to take this from like a general data science perspective. When people are talking about data science, you're going to see some version of a graph like this, or just showing what the workflow would be. It's always going to start with something around figuring out your problem space, finding your data, cleaning your data, doing the analysis, and whatever the reporting or deployment model would be. And so for us, when we think about open source data, why would we want to reinvent the wheel, literally, if you talk about the second graph over there? Every time we want to ask a new question about our communities. It's very time intensive and really starts to slow down that process and limits what your capabilities are around the analysis that you do on your communities. When you start to cut down that time, that's whenever you can start to evolve and make your visualizations a lot more complex and specific to the communities that you're looking at. So. First, let's talk about this more at a conceptual level, putting the data aside for a second. First, you have to start thinking about what is your specific problem or problem space that you want for your community. Many times people come to me and just say, I want to do the data thing. Give me general metrics about your community. And that can honestly be a pretty frustrating place to start from because I don't really know what to give. But I also understand why that is the first spot. You have to kind of figure out where you want to start and go from. That's why I really think the starter metrics model that's been set up is a really nice entryway because data can be so overwhelming. What do you do with the millions of rows and columns and all the different points and trying to figure out where to start? And so that's a good generic starting point, but then you want to start going in a little bit more about what you want to learn about your community and start going down that path. And I'll say that as a data scientist working in the community data analysis space for over 4 years, once that technical architecture is there, the difficulty lies so much more on the concept building around your visualizations. And even if somebody's technical setup is much different than yours, you can really start to collaborate on the concept side of it and start to make things that are really interesting. That's something that I really like about the Chaos community is that there is a really large span of tools that people use, but we can all come together to be able to talk about what we want to look at, what data, and what questions we want to ask, and that makes all of our analysis better. So. Once you start getting that initial question or metric, then you can start converting that question to a metric. And the first thing that I personally like to do whenever I start to ask a question is look at the research on the established metrics already. And that's what Chaos kind of does really well is gathering all the different metrics that people have talked about. There's a whole metrics model groups that has done pages and pages. And so once you have that question, those pages of resources go from being overwhelming to being incredibly useful. And that's why you kind of have to start down that path yourself, because even though those pages of information can be helpful, it can also be very overwhelming. And so once you kind of get a pointed start, it starts making it a lot easier to go along this path. And so from there, you want to start looking at the specific data points that you need. This is where your data engineering or your technical architecture is going to determine whether those data points are available. Have you set yourself up for a really general case? So even though this might be an analysis space that you haven't looked at before, are you set up for it? Or is this something that you need to establish, start looking at the data, collecting, storing, and cleaning it? And so that will be your next step. Then you would like to go into how you want to visualize and represent that data, and then go into what potential insights and actions. And this is really the first stop on your visualization building process for your communities. Once you have that first work in progress metric, that's when you want to go over and start getting your community feedback. With all of these metrics and research from the Chaos community and others, you get a good starting point, but that doesn't take in the unique qualities of your own community. And people within your community are going to have some knowledge that you might not not have either. There might be some type of anomaly, and there was some event that you didn't know about, and somebody else that was working in documentation does, and they're gonna flag that off for you. But that is going to be the process that really starts to fine-tune what visualization you make and making it very useful for your community. I'd say very rarely does one exact fit, once you start getting to more specialized metrics, work for two different communities, especially if you're looking at communities of different sizes. Let's see. So now that we've talked about things from more of a conceptual standpoint, let's look at this from a data standpoint. I would say very rarely are you going to need a single data or metric point about your community. I would say I've not really seen that scenario too much within a community where it's like, this is the one thing we want to know and then nothing else. And I would say a lot of times you would very rarely end with that same question that you started with, even in this hypothetical scenario that you want to learn that one thing. By setting up for a more general case from a specific data source, every question that you do, every visualization you make, next, we'll take out the first 2 or 3 of these steps in the data visualization, or pretty much the data science workflow. You already have established getting your data, storing it, structuring and cleaning it, and you can now start looking at making your visualization, hosting it. A lot of that architecture and background is set if you are prepared in the beginning for the most general use case. And I would say gearing your tooling or your setup to one specific question can really limit you and your community and be very time costly in the long run. I can say I worked with a community that built a really large tech stack around one very specific question around a community. And then they came back to me and wanting to do even just a minor pivot off of that. And I had to tell them that the way that they had set up their architecture didn't allow for that type of pivot. And so they had to go and set everything up all over again and find a new solution to be even able to answer a question, for example, instead of just looking at the total number of contributors, but seeing how frequent different contributors are contributing. And so whenever you get too honed in and not looking at what all is available from a data source like GitHub, it can cost you big time in the long run. And I would say as you go through as well, once you learn more about your problem space, which in this case is your community's data, and start working with the data a lot more, which in the data science world many times is called EDA, exploratory data analysis, you're going to start pivoting more and more through that process. And you'll be able to get a visualization or metric that's so much more useful than that idea that you came in right in the beginning. So these are some of your common open source community data sources. I'm curious to see, does anybody in here take data from some of these sources for their communities? I'd be curious. With that, are y'all doing like JSON dumps? How do you get this data? Just pulling straight from the API? Anybody can call API? API, everyone API? Okay. Shocker. That's what this next slide is going to be about. Whenever you're looking at those common data sources, the retrieval method is almost always going to be an API. And with those outputs being in a JSON or CVS form or CSV format. And this isn't unique to community data. This is pretty common across all data sources online. And I would say in the cases when you're not getting it from an API, maybe getting it from a direct download or scrape, that end product is still going to be a JSON or CSV. And beyond a one-time use case, having data in a JSON or CSV can get complicated really quick. I have a feeling that at least one person in this room has a file in their computer titled data_dump135. And you don't really know if that was the one that from this week or last week. And that just starts to get really complicated really quick if you're trying to even do the same visualization twice a month later. That means you have to collect your data again, store it in another file, then you have another file in a folder that you might mix up, and it just gets complicated and storage-wise very dense quickly. And a full workflow cannot be based off of a fragment, and that's what a lot of times those one use cases are. So. And in the data science world in general, A relational database is the tried and true method to store your data for repeated use. Which database you choose to use for your specific use case or preference doesn't really matter. It's more of that relational structure of your data and that structure being very consistent. A relational database, in our case, among many other things, allows for mapping between different types of contribution types and the contributors that performed them. The data is cleaned and it can be used in a reusable format. I mean, you're able to, whenever you have that structured data, looking at issues and PRs and commits and how the same exact contributors are contributing in all those different fields, you're able to do that whenever, if you're trying to look at that from a JSON file, trying to bring all of that information in and transform it into a similar format, that's something that you have to do every single time, whenever having that relational format does that for you. And so whenever you're setting up your data collection for that general use case, you have all of the data in that specific case. I'm going to talk a lot about GitHub here. The structure is clean and consistent, and there's a lot of visualization tools that are set up to plug and play to a relational database. You can think about Grafana, Superset, that data that is in there. You can start to make those high-level visualizations right off the bat, and you don't have to invest in deep levels of code or pre-processing to make those initial sets of visualization. And you can also start to evolve your analysis much quicker because of that ability to pivot. And another portion of this is that data structure, when it being standardized, it allows the pre-processing of the data to be able to be reused across many different visualizations. Each time you analyze something, the next time you want to do it in the exact same way, it takes little to no time investment. And if you want to do something that's vaguely similar, it takes a fraction of the time that it did with the first iteration. Obviously, if it's more similar, it's going to take less time, less similar, more time. And there's kind of two different ways I like to think about this, and we're actually going to get to see some of these visualizations in a second. One of those things is a structural similarity. I like to kind of think about it from a puzzle piece, is that the structure is all there. We just have one portion of that puzzle that is being taken out, and it works the same way. We can think about this from the time to first response for issues and PRs. We can look at it, pre-process the data the same exact way to see that first response, and whether that is issues or PRs, it's very little difference. Another example of this is looking at the staleness, which is how long has it been since an issue has been open versus it being closed or merged. How long has it been staying in that pending category? Whether that is issues or PRs, there's a very minimal switch. It's really just closed and merged as an additional option, but even with that, whenever you look at the data, if a PR is merged, it's still counted as closed. And then another way to look at this is the data similarity. And so many times you can take the structure of the pre-processing you've done for a similar data type, move it around a little bit, and get a completely different view on the community that you're looking at. One example of this is looking at PR review assignments per contributor or status counts. And again, we'll kind of look at this example in a second, but the idea here is that some people want to know how many PRs are being assigned to specific contributors. Is there contributors that are being incredibly overloaded with that responsibility versus others, and wanting to see how that responsibility is distributed over time? And maybe there's a case where you just want to know in the aggregate, is my community assigning PRs or is it not? Is it assigning issues or it's not? And in some cases that might not really apply to your community, but this is one of those data similarity standpoints. Another one is looking at flyby contributors versus repeat contributors. So you would want to maybe look at what are the type of contributions that are done by people who maybe only do 4 or 5 contributions and then leave the community, or what are the people who are staying in that community for a consistent and long period of time? What does their contribution activity and types look like? Even though those are looking at the inverse of each other, the data processing and the code is very similar. So how does this look like in action? So I'm going to show, in my specific case, the tools that we use that fit under this framework. But there are many tools that fit under this framework. It's kind of just the idea here. And so for our case, whenever we look at the database, we use a project under the Chaos project that is called Augur. And it takes the mountains of data that comes from GitHub. If you've ever worked with the GitHub API, you know pain. And they have done a lot of pre-processing and structuring that data in a large Postgres database. And so I'm able to, as a data scientist, just go and do SQL queries, and I get structured data that is cleaned, and I can see things across many different contribution types and see what their contributors are and doing across the different repositories. And that's not even just within one repository. I can see if a contributor, what their activity is among all of the repositories that I collect on. And so having that structure, having the data engineering, and having validated data makes my job as a data scientist so much easier, because I can focus on my analysis, not on making sure that collecting my data, cleaning it, because that's a huge undertaking. And so if we're gonna look at the high level architecture for Augur, the Postgres database, that's what I touch whenever I'm making my visualizations. The Augur tool is the one that communicates with GitHub's API and does direct pulls from just doing a git clone to get a lot of this information. And they clean it, structure it, and put in that Postgres database. And from there, we have our 8-knot dashboard. So we take this structured Augur database, it's a relational database with the Git platform data, with enforced data validation, so all of those things I can know to be true. And then built on top of this is a dashboard that we based in using Dashplotly, which those are packages in Python. We really wanted to use the Python tool set because we knew I really wanted to capitalize on the 20 plus years of data science research and backing that has gone into the packages in Python. And we were able to do the pre-processing in Python and do the visualizations in Plotly with all of the data from Augur. So it's kind of that plug and play. If you've ever seen Grafana or Superset, you can kind of think about it the same way. We get those database credentials, we now have our dashboard, and we're able to make these visualizations. Sweet. Now we're going to do a little bit of a demo so you can see some of the visualizations I've been talking about. We did a workshop a couple days ago, and I lost all the slides trying to switch over to the demo. So I'm no longer allowed to do that. Sweet. Thank you. So this is the 8-knot dashboard. You will be able to see a hosted version of this online. We'll have the link to this in our final slide. You can come and talk to us about it. This initial welcome page, if y'all do go and look at this a little bit more, there's a bunch of different tabs talking about how to use the dashboard, how to make user groups, which is a combination of a bunch of different repositories, how to get the database to start collecting on the repositories you care about. All that good stuff, all that information is right there for your use. But let's look at some of those visualizations that I was talking about. And this is also a really good example of what Don was talking about earlier, of the wall of metrics. There is a whole lot of metrics here, and which ones do you care about looking at? If you haven't taken the step beforehand, asking yourself what questions you want to ask, there's a whole lot of colors and bars, and they don't really mean very much until you start to get a little bit of a perspective of what you want to know. So one of those examples that we were talking about where you're kind of using similar data but changing around the code and the structure a bit, you have this pull request review assignment. So it's looking at the assignments by contributor versus the status count. And then whenever we're looking at two different, I don't like that. We're looking at the staleness of issues is very similar to the staleness of activities, or the staleness of pull requests. And so those were a couple of the different graphs that we were talking about. What time is it? We have a little bit of time. I'll hop around a little bit. Another thing that people seem to really be interested in is the contributor affiliation. So where are your contributors contributing from? If you're able to identify if they're associated with any individual group or company. This is one of those things where you're able to take, I think about this as a general page, as a general question of what is the organizational diversity of my project. It would be great if you could just get a list out of numbers and how many people are individual contributors, how many people are for which company. We don't really have that data, but we can start to at that question from a lot of different angles to start to get a holistic view on the project's makeup. And so an example of this is that there's two different graphs right here, and one looks at the unique emails of all the contributors. So even if I contribute 1,000 times, my email counts once. If somebody contributes once, their email counts once. So that gives you one view, while the commit activity by domain, that's going to be proportional to the amount of activity that's in the repository. And so it's not going to tell you the full picture from either one, but you start to be able to get a more full view of your community when you start to look at things from different angles. So this is the app. I'll pass this over to Dawn, and if people have other questions or things they want to look at the end, we can do that as well.
Okay, cool. So I am going to show you a little bit about the starter project health metrics model after I just let me reconfigure everything, and then we'll be good. Okay. Okay, perfect. Nope, almost perfect. Nope, it's this way. Okay, there we go. Now I've got the cursor on the screen that I'm looking at. These things are important. Okay, so Cali talked a lot about gathering data. You've seen her demo of 8-Knot using Augur, but it's also important to do something useful with all of this data, right? So the data is great, but we talked earlier about the tsunami of data, and tools like Augur, 8-Knot, and other visualization tools, as we've both mentioned, don't actually solve this problem for you. You still need to think about what questions you have and what you want to learn about your project to help you focus, right? Focus on the data and the visualizations that you actually need to see. So in the case of open source project health metrics, I did create the starter project health metrics model with 4 very simple metrics that I mentioned on the earlier slide about chaos metrics models. So if you're still figuring out which questions to ask, you can use this data as a starting point to improve your project and your community. Now, not everybody needs this. If you're already experienced in metrics, you're already using it, then you probably don't need these at all. But they're a really, we found them to be a really helpful way for people who are just getting started. And I'll talk about a few ways to interpret this data so that you can use what you've learned to make actual real improvements. And then hopefully what you learn from these 4 metrics will generate new questions and new ideas for what additional data you might need for your project. I recommend measuring contributor sustainability using bus factor, which is also called the lottery factor, because it helps you understand what might happen to a project if one or more of the key people on your project won the lottery, retired on a beach, and very suddenly left your project with little to no notice and never came back. There are a couple of things this metric can tell you. First of all, how big of an issue is your current contributor situation? If it's like this one, you really should focus on getting a few more people who can contribute and eventually be moved into leadership roles like maintainers or reviewers, for example. Now, this graph shows the top 10 contributors to a project, and out of those top 10, these are the percentages of contributions. So you can see that there are 2 people who are responsible for quite a few of those contributions, but there are also quite a few other people who aren't that far behind them. So this one's looking pretty good. But one reason I really like this metric is that you often find that there are people who are contributing more than you realized. And this can help you think about who you can encourage to contribute more, and maybe find someone who could move into a leadership role. Reaching out to someone and acknowledging their work while encouraging them to do more can help quite a bit with growing your contributor base. Sometimes people just need a bit of encouragement, And you can ask them for specific things that you know that they're particularly good at. There are several communities that I've personally gotten more involved in because someone came to me and asked me for my help with something specific. And in this case, you might look at the people making fewer commits to decide maybe they're ready to become a maintainer. Or if not, maybe they're good candidates for becoming, for being mentored, for mentorship. Or becoming reviewers with an eye toward then making them maintainers after they get just a little more experience within the project. Now the catch here, and with many metrics, is that we don't just want to think about the people making commits and pull requests. It's a good start, right? But you should also be thinking about how you can move people into maintainership or other leadership positions to be responsible for things that might not show up in a repository, like documentation, community management, marketing, product management, all of the other things you need within your project that are really important roles for you to be successful. It's really important to keep up with requests and resolve them in a timely manner. Even if the response is closing requests that aren't going to be merged, which can be a difficult conversation, and it is very easy to get behind on incoming contributions. We all get behind sometimes, but not addressing these contributions promptly creates technical debt and reduces the chances that they'll ever be merged because those old change requests or pull requests are likely to have so many merge conflicts that they're just going to be too difficult to accept after a certain point in time. Now, it can be tempting to solve problems with responsiveness by putting some extra pressure on the existing maintainers and asking them to respond more quickly and resolve more contributions. But this rarely actually solves the long-term problem. You might get some short-term gains, but it could be damaging to the community and the project over time if all you're doing is burning out your maintainers by not resolving the underlying problems that are causing the lack of responsiveness in the first place. If you see responsiveness declining, it might be time to move more contributors into leadership roles and promote some contributors to become maintainers for your project. As I mentioned on the contributor sustainability slides, you can start by looking at those contributors within your project to find people who are contributing regularly but maybe aren't already maintainers. And a good first step really is to promote some of those people to reviewer roles, where they can reduce some of the load on maintainers by reviewing contributions from other community members. More people reviewing contributions should provide better responsiveness, since maintainers will have less work to do for each contribution, and then they can focus on the things that require maybe more expertise within the project. It's also important for projects to respond to requests in a timely manner, because a quick response can help you retain contributors who otherwise might become discouraged if they just never get a response or get a response months later after they've forgotten that they even submitted a pull request. So timely, thoughtful, and kind responses to contributors indicate that you appreciate their work. In both of these responsiveness metrics, it's really important to focus on the trends. If responsiveness is already improving, great, keep up the good work. However, if you see responsiveness declining, then it might be time to find ways to improve it, including, as I mentioned earlier, recruiting more contributors and maintainers. But talk to your maintainers and find out what else they spend their time on. If maintainers spend a lot of time on things like community management, documentation, or other tasks, then maybe recruiting people to help in those roles would be time well spent to free up time for maintainers. In other cases, improved documentation might help reduce maintainer workload. For example, if maintainers are spending a ton of time onboarding contributors or answering questions about the contribution process, maybe better onboarding docs or contributing guides would free up some of their time to focus on responding to incoming contributions. It can also help to use templates for things like issues and merge requests or pull requests, since anything you can do to help contributors make good contributions that require less work from reviewers and maintainers can really help improve responsiveness. The other point I wanted to make on the slide is that there are a lot of different ways to visualize data using the CHAOSS Project's Augur tool. So in this case, I wanted to focus on the trends and display some additional explanatory data above and below the slide. So I created these visualizations by writing queries against Augur's Postgres database. So this is the exact same database that Cali uses in 8.0, which I use to collect the data. And then I just use standard Python libraries like matplotlib and Seaborn to actually just create the visualization. And again, this is a custom visualization, primarily because where an individual project releases varies quite a bit, depending on the type of project that it is. But regardless of where the releases can be found, it is really important to look at the frequency of releases, including all of the releases, even those little teeny point releases, because it's critical that security updates and bug fixes actually land in a release in a timely manner. And it's important to get those new features out as well. And an appropriate release frequency for your project is influenced by the size of your project, maybe how many dependencies you have on other projects that are also releasing fixes that you'll need to incorporate. For projects that you contribute to, you should think about whether you're cutting releases frequently enough to keep the project up to date and secure. Now the catch is that none of this is something that you get to do once and then just forget about. Regardless of what metrics you're using, you should be thinking about how to make this a continuous improvement process. So the starter project health metrics might be a good start, but you probably want to add a few more metrics later to better understand other aspects of your project. And then when you take action to make some improvements, you'll want to monitor those metrics over time to see if the actions are making a difference, and to see if any improvements actually persist over time. Here is a link to, the top link is to the CHAOSS community, where you can find our metrics, our meetings, our software, our podcasts, our blog posts, and all kinds of information about how you can participate in the CHAOSS project, or just use the stuff that we create. That's cool too. The metrics with an X link is to a software as a service offering hosted by the CHAOSS project, where you can use Augur and 8.0. You can add your own repositories, as long as they're public, or view ones already added by other people. You can also have a look at the 8.0 repo if you're interested in learning more about how they've created their visualizations, and you can contribute new ones. So it's fairly straightforward to build on the existing visualizations and create new ones that are similar, that meet your particular needs. And I've also added a link to an article called Beyond the Repository, which it's a short read. It's something like 6 pages. But it talks about some of the things you should be thinking about, like responsible use of data when gathering and analyzing data about open source projects. So it's something that I just kind of recommend to basically anyone doing research or open source metrics gathering. Now, throughout this whole presentation, we've talked about how the data for open source projects can just feel like a tsunami of never-ending, overwhelming amounts of data. Cali talked about how to use a data science workflow as part of your process for thinking about how you can use data to answer the questions you have about your project, along with how to gather your data and store it in a standardized data structure, like a database, for example, to give you the flexibility that you need to answer additional questions in the future, so that you can reuse what you've already gathered to produce additional visualizations from that same data. You should also think about how you can build on the work that other people have already done, right? Like the metrics and software that we've developed for the CHAOSS project, for example. And you should work with your community to help understand what the data is telling you, so that you can build a more rich interpretation that helps your project make improvements. But having the data and the visualizations is really the start of the journey. It's not the end. You need to understand what it all means for you and for your project by coming up with actionable insights and ways that you can improve your project as part of a cycle of monitoring the data to ensure that you're continuously improving and learning as your project evolves. With that, thank you, and we have plenty of time for questions.
So we're short on microphones. If you have a question, shout it loud, and then I'll just ask Callie and Don to please Make sure you repeat it so the people streaming will be able to catch it on the mic.
Okay, go ahead. So what do we say about Goddard's law, which is once you make a metric public, it becomes a bad metric? Do you want to start with this, or do you want me to? You can say your opinion. Okay. Yes, anything that you measure will likely be gamed by someone. So one of the things that I've tried to do, so in particular when I was at VMware, I really tried, I used those 4 starter project health metrics with all of our projects. Because my thinking was that because these metrics really are about improving your project, that most of the things that they could do to make those numbers go up were probably good things. So I try to make it so that if they do try to game it, so that the numbers are better, that hopefully it will be done in a way that makes the project better. However, I've also seen it go terribly wrong because at a certain company that I worked at, one of the business units decided that they were going to take OKRs, so basically how they were going to measure the performance of their employees were based on my metrics and whether or not, because I had like a kind of a green-red scheme. And my response to that was, oh my gosh, please no, please don't do that. Because I've set random arbitrary thresholds that are what I think work for most of that company's projects, but they're not, there's no one-size-fits-all metric. Like they blatantly won't work well for certain projects, those thresholds. So what I talked them into was that they should make an improvement to something every single quarter or whatever it was, so that they could show that they made some improvement into their project. So it could be anything, and as long as they were improving something, then that was good.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I'd say the first one is that this is why I like having multiple visualizations that's looking at like a similar space. If we look at the like affiliations page, for example, that has a couple of different visualizations that are all looking at similar things, I think that helps prevent the gamification problem, because once you're starting to shine the light in a couple of different angles, if they're all showing a positive trend, then I kind of go to what Dawn's saying, that it probably means something positive. I would also say is that once you start getting into a larger visualization portfolio, I think it's pretty hard to start like, I would dare someone to try to, I don't know if I want to dare, but being like, gamify all of the metrics on 8-Not, sure, that'll take you a lot of time, but I think the quickest way to gamify them would be to just make improvements in your community.
Other questions?
Yeah, I think everyone you ask in this space is going to say something a little bit different. And so I'm kind of glad that Dawn's here as well, because I think she's going to answer this very differently than I would. The initial thing that I would say is that if you're trying to look at those repositories in aggregate, if all of them grouped together is what really matters, then I would say, okay, then you can start looking and using like 8-Not, and I'm too scared to touch it. And you can put in the search bar all of those repositories. That's when you could create a user group. And so you can start looking at all of those metrics in an aggregate way. And then if you're trying to, if it's all about the individual ones, then I would say that you would start to look at it more of an individualistic way. I think that one thing that's also really interesting is there's a project velocity graph that we have on 8-Not that you can choose what the weights are for issues, PRs, and different actions of what matters the most, and you can see the velocity, which is something that you choose, of those repositories next to each other. You're looking at like activity for issues, PRs, and then it's the number of contributors is the size of like the dot, and then the axis, I think the other axis is commits. But looking at visualizations that will put them all in a comparative chart. So it's more matters of whether you need to see them as individuals or if you need to see them all together.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, those starter metrics are really just designed to get you thinking about what you need. What I actually recommend that projects do, or companies, if they're shepherding some open source projects, is to really take a step back and think about what your overall organization, so your project or your company, what they're trying to achieve, how the work that you're doing within that project fits into that broader structure, and then what metrics do you need to show that you're successful in whatever this criteria was. So this is what's going to be different for every single project. Like, you can start with some things to get you thinking about what your options are, but you really should, at some point, really take a step back and figure out what you need to achieve and how you can justify it. Because it's something, particularly in the financial climate that we're in right now, right? Like, it's kind of hard. Like, companies are looking for things that they can cut, right? And you don't want to be that thing that gets cut. So if you can use your metrics to justify why the work that you're doing is important and why you're succeeding at that work, then you'll be a lot more likely to make it through the next wave. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, how do you measure those other things that aren't code metrics, so some of the conversational things? We actually have a lot of metrics defined within the Chaos project that aren't based on what we refer to as like trace data, so the stuff that you can just get out of APIs. But focused on things like, in particular, like diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of that is best measured by surveys. How do people feel about the things that are happening within the community and their place in it? So surveys are certainly a good way to do that. And you can also do, you can pull a lot of the trace data about conversations and do sentiment analysis and things like that. One of the things that we've done quite a bit within like Kubernetes community, for example, is try to push most things into GitHub, right? So even things like organizing the contributor summit, those are based on issues and markdown files. So people are contributing to those, and then you can see some of those other contributions for things that might not necessarily always happen in the repository. Similar thing for documentation. And same thing for like product management. A lot of that's done in the case of Kubernetes, GitHub project boards, GitHub project boards. So you can push a lot of stuff to some of these repositories for things that you might not naturally think of in that way.
I'm looking a lot right now at response frequencies. So whenever you look at issues or PRs, what are the conversations that are happening around them? The first response is kind of that initial look at it, seeing how quickly are people getting responses on either one. But then also, how is the conversation going, like not even just looking at that first response, seeing if when the issue opener or PR opener, how long in that conversation thread are they waiting for another response? And then something that I want to start looking at, kind of that next stage of this, is seeing if there is a very large skewed behavior on responses for like different groups of people. So say if you look at like the top 10 contributors maybe, and how do they conversate with one another, then maybe how is the response to like a new contributor, or looking at different ways to break down the activity, because I think that there might be some trends that you'll be able to see, that some people get really fast responses and then some people don't get responses at all, and starting to take it a little bit more granular.
All right. Let's have a round of applause. Thank you, Callie and Don.